Chair now recognizes the ranking member for his first round of questions. Pursuant to House Resolution 660, the ranking member or his counsel have 45 minutes to question the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it's become very evident why this hearing is here and why the craziness of this hearing, especially not having Mr. Schiff here. But please put back up the last slide. I have no idea what number it is. Not as good a counsel as
53.
53.
Yep.
Did we cut it off after they got through?
It was 11 seconds.
Okay, well, while we're doing this, I mean, I think it's just the most amazing statement came out there. We're proofing the tweet that said that he thought that the Democrats were concerned about impeachment. There's nothing the Democrats have not been concerned about for 2.5 years. Since November 2016. The president's saying nothing new in that tweet. There's now back up. He's known that they have been after impeachment. That's why Mr. Goldman is here. That's why Mr. Burke is here. That's why we're going through this charade of staff having to answer staff questions. And basically, when we don't like how it's going, we start asking staff on staff and getting into a staff argument. Where's Adam? Where's Adam? It's his report, his name. Mr. Goldman, you're a great attorney, but you're not Adam Schiff, and you don't wear a pen.
That's true.
We got a problem here. And the problem is developing this. You said you were an attorney. You're a very good prosecutor. I believe it. I've read your bio. You're a good attorney. You understand what quid pro quo is, correct?
I do.
You understand what asking for something in exchange for something actually means, correct?
I do.
You know about the conversation of Mr. Biden when he asked and he said, I'm not going to give you the $1 billion. You know about that conversation, correct? You want me to read it to you, or do you know it?
One second. Are you talking about in 2015?
No, I'm talking about the one from the national, where you did I'll read it to you since you're having trouble. As I remember going over to the Ukraine, convincing our team, our leaders, convincing them that we should provide for loan guarantees. As I went over, I guess the 12th or 13th time to Kiev, I was supposed to announce that there was a $1 billion loan guarantee. And I'd gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and they said that they would take action against the state prosecutor. They didn't. So they said they were walking out to the press conference. I said, nah, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have authority, and you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said, I said, call him, laughter. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm getting ready to be leaving here, and I think about 6 hours. I looked at them and said, I'm leaving here in 6 hours. If the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch, he got fired. Did he ask for something, request something, and hold something of value?
He did. George Kent testified that was...
I think I'll do what you did. George Kent testified this. I'm asking about not George Kent. I'm asking about this question.
Right, but it's important context.
It's not. Answer this question. Did he or did he not? Either Joe Biden's a liar, telling a story to make people impressed, or he actually did this. Which is it?
He did it pursuant to U.S. official policy.
So he did it in withholding actual dollars, actual thing, holding this out there. So Joe Biden, of everybody that we discussed about, is the only one that's done a quid pro quo. He's the only one that's used taxpayer dollars to actually threaten a foreign government. And yet we're sitting here pretending that this is not happening. We're sitting here pretending that a president of the United States now would not be concerned. Look, you look at it this way. Joe Biden's a terrible candidate. He can destroy himself on the campaign trail, but he can't get by this. And it doesn't matter who brings it up. It doesn't matter who does it, because this is what happened. And you can whitewash it all you want. You can go over whatever you want, but that's what he did. He's either a liar or he did it, and he did it. I want to continue on. Question is a question that you had earlier. You rely on approximately how many times do you rely on Gordon Sondland's testimony in your report?
Oh, it's nearly a 300-page report.
Would you be amazed if it was 600 times or better? You wouldn't have any idea or not?
I have no idea.
Okay? You did. It's over 600 times. Would you also understand, if you do a simple check of your report, that over 158 times Mr. Sondland said, instead of not knowing something, to the best of my knowledge, or I don't know? Would that surprise you?
Are you talking about the report or his deposition?
The deposition and the closed-door testimony.
Yes, and over time he remembered a lot more as he was refreshed by other people's testimony.
It is. The question we're having here, though, is Mr. Sondland also said, and many times he said he presumed what actually happened. Let's go back to something else. We're going to continue this in just a moment. According to your report, HIPSI, and we'll classify that and we'll determine that to be the Intelligence Committee and the other investigation with the other two committees. We okay with that?
Certainly.
Okay. Issued dozens of subpoenas, is that right?
I'm not, certainly over a dozen, yes.
Some of the subpoenas were not publicly reported until the HPSI issued its majority report, correct?
Most of the subpoenas were
Answer
not
the question. As
publicly-
Mr. Burke had so much free reign, let's go at it. Either answer the question or elaborate, one or the other.
Sir, I'm trying to answer the question.
Did you or didn't you? Did it come out or not?
Did what come out?
I'll read it again. Some of the subpoenas were not publicly reported until the HPSI issued its majority report, correct?
Yes, they were given to the minority, but not the public, yes.
Putting aside the witnesses who have publicly been identified, did you issue any other subpoenas for testimony other than the ones publicly identified?
I'm not sure. I don't think
Okay.
so.
Thank you.
But I'm not sure.
How many subpoenas were issued for records?
Well, we issued a number of subpoenas for records. We did issue 6 subpoenas to executive branch agencies, and they all defied our subpoenas.
In this, moving on to other issues here, the Wall Street Journal reported that the committee issued at least 4 subpoenas to Verizon and AT&T for call records. Is that correct? Are we wondering?
Yes, we are, because there are multiple numbers. We only issued subpoenas for call records for people who were involved in the investigation and who had already been subpoenaed by the committee for documents and testimony of their own.
Absolutely wonderful stuff, but answer my question. 4?
Well, I am trying to answer your question.
Was it at least 4?
Yes.
Thank you. Could have saved us a lot of time there. How many subpoenas were issued to AT&T?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Can you check your records? This is important because we just found out about this over the weekend. We got a massive document dump over the weekend preparing for this hearing in which the chairman admitted and the staff admitted they're not going to be able to read it all anyway. So for all of you writing reports about this, all that massive document dump, we're just simply going on a Schiff report which Schiff refuses to come testify about but sends his staff. So this is important stuff. We just found out about this. So how many subpoenas were issued to AT&T?
I don't know. If you'd like me to find
That's
out during
fine.
the
If you
break,
don't know,
I'd be happy to.
then again, maybe your chairman could be here to actually answer this. Was it targeted at a single telephone number or numbers?
We subpoenaed for call records, multiple numbers.
How many?
I don't know. None of, this is
Okay,
very important,
let's just
though.
stop here.
None of members of Congress, none of staff of Congress.
Oh, we're getting to that.
None of journalists.
We're getting to that.
We only did it to the subjects who were involved in the investigation, which is a very routine and standard investigative practice. Sir.
And you're not going to hear anything from me about a subpoena and the legality of a subpoena. My problem is this. Who on the committee asked that those numbers that you actually did put into for a subpoena and get those numbers back? Who was it that asked that they be cross-checked for members of the media and members of the Congress? Who ordered that?
I don't think that's how we did it, sir.
No, whoa. You came out with a report that actually showed these people, such as Mr. Chairman Nunez and others, were actually on these calls.
Yes.
Now, someone, and you and I, we're not going to play cute here. Somebody took the 4 records that you asked for, at least 4, took those numbers and then said, hey, let's play match game. Who ordered the match game for members of Congress and the press? Was it you?
I don't think anyone did, sir.
Then how did you get, okay, come on, that's the most ridiculous item I've ever heard. You don't just all of a sudden pick up numbers in which you have to match those numbers to actually show where they are, and you don't come up with them. Who ordered them to actually match for members of Congress and the press?
That's actually what you just described is exactly how it happens.
Who ordered to find out if Nunez's number was on those calls?
If I could just explain, sir. You pick an event of significance in the investigation, and you look for sequencing and patterns surrounding that event. You look then at the numbers, and you try to identify what those numbers are, and then you start to build the circumstantial case.
At this point, that's a wonderful explanation, but not an answer to my question. Those are you looking for the 4 numbers you asked for and to see how they're connected. I understand the subpoena that you issued. My question directly, was it you or was it Chairman Schiff that said, while we're doing this, let's see if this matches Chairman Nunez's number. Let's see if this matches a member of the press's number. Somebody along the way just didn't all of a sudden have an epiphany, unless you're getting ready to throw a low-level staffer under the bus, that these numbers might match. So who did it? Was it Chairman Schiff or was it you? Be careful, you're under oath.
I know I'm under oath, sir.
Then answer the question.
Matter. And I will answer the question if you give me a second here. It's not a simple
The
answer.
same second that was not afforded to my witness, by the way.
Well, I think he was allowed to
Who decided
answer
to
the
leak
question.
it, by the way? If you're not going to tell me the other story, while you're thinking about how you're going to answer that question, who decided to leak it? The information. Why did you include it in the report?
That's not a leak, sir.
Why did you include it in the report? After not saying anything else about this, not publicly known. So 2 questions are hanging out that everybody's looking for an answer for, including me. Who ordered it? Was it you or was it Chairman Schiff? And then why was it decided, except for nothing but smear purposes, to be included in the Schiff report?
Well, I'm not going to get into the deliberations of our investigation with you, and I will tell you the reason it was included in the report is because the calls were surrounding important evidence to our investigation. And I think that your question is frankly not better directed not at me, but at the people who were having conversations.
Oh, no. We're not going to play that game. No, we're not going to play that game. You're as good as Mr. Burke. You're not going to play that game. You're not answering the question. And every member of the media, everybody here, when you start going into the decorum of this House, when you start looking at members' telephone numbers, you start looking at reporters' telephone numbers, which they ought to be scared about, you took a subpoena for 4. And then you decided to play match game. You found numbers that you thought were like, some of them actually didn't exist because they claimed that they were for the White House Budget Office, and they were not. So we're throwing stories out there because nobody was out there acting. So I go back to my question. Are you going to go on record in front of everybody here today and say that you will not tell who ordered this, you or Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman, you or Mr. Schiff?
I am going to go on record and tell you that I'm not going to reveal how we conducted this investigation.
And that's the problem we have with this entire thing. Mr. Schiff said behind closed doors.
I can tell you what the importance is.
I'm done with you for right now. We're done. You're not answering the question. You're not being honest about this answer because you know who it is. You're just not answering. Mr. Castor.
I have some information on the subpoenas.
Let's go.
We did receive copies of the subpoenas, and we tracked this. There were 6, as I understand it. And let me just say at the outset, our members have concerns about this exercise for 3 reasons. The subpoenas yielded information about members of Congress. Whether they're subpoenaed the members' phone records or not, it's a concern when the information yields member of Congress's phone records, and then the information is publicized. Second is with journalists. It's just generally a very tricky area to start investigating journalists' call records. And the third is with regard to Mr. Giuliani, who was serving as the president's personal attorney. But there's 6 subpoenas, as we understand it. The first went to AT&T for the Giuliani numbers. The second was in regard to Igor Fruman, to a company, CSC Holdings. The third related to Mr. Sondland. That was off to Verizon. The fourth was back to AT&T, seeking information on a certain number. The fifth was back to AT&T, and the sixth was seeking subscriber information, which impacted the veteran journalist John Solomon. And also involved with these are some, some of the attorneys involved, such
Mr.
as
Castor, can I ask you a question?
Ms. Tunsing and Geneva.
Mr. Castor, you've been a veteran of the Hill investigators for 15 years, and this is crazy. I've never seen anything like this. You never have either. Would it be interesting to note, because Mr. Goldman chooses not to answer because he doesn't want to incriminate, I believe, either himself or the chairman or somebody else. Would it be interesting to you to find, as you've dealt with committee staff for a long time, somebody to just have an epiphany just to do those match records on their own, or were they under direction by somebody to do that?
Well, it's obviously they were trying to figure something out.
That's it. All right, one last, well, I'm getting ready to try. Wait, I have one thing for Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman, we're used to committees and people and witnesses taking gratuitous shots at people they don't like. And earlier today, in your testimony, you made a comment that really goes to an interesting thing, and I'll even go back to the chairman questioning motive. When your testimony, you said, as you were discussing Mr. Sondland, you made a very snide comment, your facial expression showed that he was $1 million donor to the president. The implication being he either got his job because he bought it, or his implication was he was loyal to the president and say anything about it. Be very careful about how you throw around dollars in giving, because you and Mr. Burke are real heavy donors to the Democratic Party. And I'm not going to say it questions your motive or your position here today, but we need to make sure that this thing is already blown out of proportion. We're already not answering questions, and you are here without a pen because your chairman will not testify. That says all we need to hear. He don't even stand behind his own report, and he sends you. I hope it works out for you. I'm done. At this point, I turn it over to Ashley.
Could I respond? Are you trying to say that I, what are you trying to say? What is the implication here? But by the way, I didn't give anything close to $1 million remotely, so I don't know.
The implication is we want Schiff in that chair, not you. The implication is the person that wrote the report is the person that should come and present it, and you weren't elected by anybody, and you're here giving this testimony in place of the chairman. I hope that clears up the implication.
The gentleman does not have the time, and the gentleman has been warned before. He cannot simply yell out and disrupt the committee. The gentleman, Mr. Collins, has the time.
I think you understand exactly what you did. And I called it out for just the way you did. You thought you were going to get by with it, and you didn't. That's all I'm saying. Ms. Cowan.
Well, I would like to just say one other thing.
Yeah, I am done.
Point of order, there's
I am
no
done.
question before the gentleman.
I mean, you're casting aspersions.
No, as you did,
personally.
as you did, Mr. Goldman.
Point of order.
As you did, Mr. Sunderland. Now, according to the chairman's own ruling just a few minutes ago, I'm done asking questions, and I'm not asking you to elaborate because I'm not asking you any more questions. I've asked all. You won't answer the question on who told the committee to actually check these numbers. You won't say if it's you or if it's Mr. Schiff. You won't answer my questions, so we're done. We're going to Ms. Cowan. You have, as was Mr. Burke said, you'll have plenty of time with helpful majority counsel to answer the
Does the gentleman yield his time to Ms. Cowan?
Yes.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Ms. Cowan,
Collins.
if I may. I'm
Yes,
so sorry.
certainly.
I have
Mr. Castor?
I have a number of things I think I need to clear up, if I may.
Yes, certainly.
And you have to bear with me because I have a number of them here. First of all, on the call, Tim Morrison, General Kellogg have a totally different view of the call than Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Jennifer Williams, going to the point that the call is ambiguous. So that's the first thing. Tim Morrison testified that he went to the National Security Council lawyers for a very different reason. He did not say he went to the NSC lawyers because he was concerned about the call. He went to the National Security Council lawyers for two reasons. Number one, they weren't on the call, so he wanted to update them about it. But number two, he was concerned about leaks. And he was concerned that if this call leaked out, how it would play in Washington's polarized environment, which is exactly what we have here. He was also concerned that if the call leaked, that it might affect bipartisan support in Congress. You know, issues of Ukraine have traditionally been one of the few issues where Republicans and Democrats share interests. And the third reason was that he didn't want the Ukrainians to get a distorted perception of what actually happened on the call, because on the call, we're talking about 8 lines of concern and a lot of ambiguity. This Oval Office meeting on May 23rd, there's this question, I guess it's ambiguous, I didn't think it was ambiguous, but there's a question about whether when the president referred the delegation goes to the inauguration May 20th. They come back, it's Sondland, it's Volker, and it's Secretary Perry and it's Senator Johnson. And they're briefing the president, and the president is having none of it. He says Ukraine is concerned or corrupt, and he doesn't want to invite Zelensky to the White House. And the president, and Volker testifies to this pretty definitively, the president, essentially, he doesn't order anybody to do anything. The president says, talk to Rudy. And Volker testified both at his deposition and at the public hearing that he didn't take it as a direction. It's just like, look, if you guys think this is important and you want to work it, just go talk to Rudy. It's very different than a direction. It's very different than the president ordering a scheme. And it's very, very different from the president sort of collecting up a bunch of agents to go do something. Because he simply, according to Ambassador Volker, said, go talk to Rudy. Now, whether the Ukrainians knew of the aid pause, or the aid was paused for 55 days,
Right.
Whether the Ukrainians knew about it or not has been, Laura Cooper from DOD and, some State Department witnesses testified about light queries that they had received. There was an article on November 22nd in Bloomberg, and the Zelensky administration said they never knew about the hold in the aid until August 28th Politico article. And they said in the article, and Yarmak is the principal person they're relying on here, Yarmak says that they believe the embassy was keeping information from them. Another interesting thing Mr. Yarmak says in that November 22nd Bloomberg article is that he recounts the pull-aside meeting with Sondland, which has become very significant, apparently. And the pull-aside meeting, he says, he doesn't recall it the way Ambassador Sondland recalled it. Now, keep in mind, Mr. Yarmak speaks English, but it's not his first language. And so he does not recall the pull-aside meeting, which, by the way, happened on the way to an escalator after the meeting with the vice president. So he recalls it very differently. So the question and the facts of what happened between Ambassador Sondland and Mr. Yarmak on the way to the escalator remain in dispute.
Yes.
Now, turning attention to the Ron Johnson letter, if I may.
Yes.
On August 31st, Senator Johnson's getting ready to travel to Ukraine on September 5th with Senator with Murphy. And Johnson wanted the aid release, so he calls the president. He actually sought permission to be the bearer of good news.
Right.
The president said, I'm not ready to lift the aid. And they had this, Senator Johnson, I mean, he writes a 10-page letter, very detailed. And he gives some remarkable detail. And I'd like to read it. It's on page 6. This is Senator Johnson speaking. He said, I asked him whether there was some kind of arrangement where Ukraine would take some action and the hold would be lifted. Without hesitation, Senator Johnson says, President Trump immediately denied such an arrangement existed, and he started cursing. And he said, no way. President Trump said, no way, I would never do that. Who told you that? And Senator Johnson goes on to say that President Trump's reaction here was adamant, vehement, and angry. Senator Johnson goes on to say that as of August 31st, the president told him, but you're going to like my decision in the end. So I think that's very important context on what the president's state of mind was, at least as of August 31st.
Right. He fully expected, do you agree, that the aid would eventually be released after the 55-day pause?
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yes. I want to thank y'all for your presentations. Mr. Castor, I believe you've been talking for approximately 75 minutes today, and I want to thank you for that.
My wife thanks you as well. She likes it when I do the talking when she's not around.
Time permitting today, I'd like to cover 4 or 5 areas, distinct areas. There's a lot of facts that the American people have not heard. And there's a lot of contradictions in certain people's testimony. Is that fair to say, Mr. Castor? And I'd like to talk about some of the people in this story that have firsthand knowledge of the facts. We have Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, and Secretary Perry. You had the opportunity to talk to 2 of those 3 people, is that correct?
Yes.
And the Democrats' report would like us to believe that these 3 individuals were engaged in some sort of cabal or some sort of nefarious venture. But that's not true, is it?
No.
In fact, these 3 people were at all relevant times, and even today, acting in the best interest of the American people. Is that true?
That's right. And with the highest integrity.
That's right. I think everyone testified that Ambassador Volker is one of the most experienced diplomats in our foreign service.
Across the board, all the witnesses, including Ambassador Yovanovitch, talked about the integrity that Ambassador Volker brings to the table.
But there's a lot of people with firsthand knowledge that we didn't talk to. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now I want to talk about the president's skepticism of foreign aid. The president is very skeptical of foreign aid. Is that correct?
He is deeply skeptical of sending U.S. taxpayer dollars into an environment that is corrupt because it's as good as kissing it goodbye.
And is that something new that he believes, or is that something he ran on?
This is something that he has ran on. It's something that he has implemented policies as soon as he became president. Ambassador Hale, the third-ranking State Department official, told us about the overall review of all foreign aid programs, and he described it as almost a zero-based evaluation.
Right, and you had the opportunity to take the deposition of Mark Sandy, who is a career official at OMB, is that right?
Correct.
And he had some information about the reason for the pause. Is that true? I think that he had a conversation with an individual named Rob Blair, and Mr. Blair provided some insight into the reason for the pause.
Sandy was one of the few witnesses that we had that was able to give us a firsthand account inside of OMB, the reason for the pause related to the president's concern about European burden sharing in the region.
And in fact, in his conversations, the president's conversations with Senator Johnson, he mentions his concern about burden sharing. And I believe he referenced a conversation that he had with the Chancellor of Germany. And in fact, the whole first part of the July 24th transcript, he's talking about burden sharing and wanting the Europeans to do more. But
yeah, I mean, Senator Johnson and President Trump were pretty candid, and they believed that allies like Germany were laughing at us because we were so willing to spend the aid.
right. Now I'd like, there's been a lot of allegations that President Zelensky is not being candid about feeling pressure from President Trump. And isn't it true that he's stated over and over publicly that he felt no pressure from President Trump? Is that true?
Yeah, he said it consistently. He said it in the United Nations September 25th. He said it, in 3 more news availabilities over the course of the period, including last week.
I want to change subjects and talk about something that Professor Turley raised last week, and that is the partisan nature of this investigation. And you're an experienced congressional investigator.
And Professor Turley, by the way, I mean, he's no Trump supporter.
That's right. He is a Democrat. That's right. But Professor Turley cautioned that a partisan inquiry is not what the founders envisioned. Is that correct?
Correct.
And
The worst thing you can have with an impeachment is partisan rancor, because nobody's going to accept the result on the other side.
And our Democrat friends have all of a sudden become originalists and are citing the founders and their intent routinely as part of this impeachment process.
I think that goes to whether this constitutes bribery. There's case law on bribery, and I'm no Supreme Court scholar or lawyer or advocate, but there's new case law with the McDonald case about what constitutes an official act, and that certainly hasn't been addressed in this space, and I think Professor Turley mentioned that.
Right, and I think Professor Turley said that a meeting certainly does not constitute an official act.
I think it's the McDonald case.
Right.
Goes to
And
that.
Professor Turley pointed that out for us last week. Yes. Since this inquiry's unofficial and unsanctioned start in September, the process has been partisan, biased, unfair. Republicans' questioning has been curtailed routinely. I think we saw that in Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's deposition. There was some,
Yeah, we were barred from asking him questions about who he communicated his concerns to.
right, very basic things like who, what, when, where. And instead,
And I would say, too, this rapid, we're in day 76, and it's almost impossible to do a sophisticated congressional investigation that quickly, especially when the stakes are this high, because any congressional investigation of any consequence, it does take a little bit of time for the two sides to stake out their interests and how they're going to respond to them.
Right.
We learned with the Goodlatte Gowdy probe, the first letter I think went in October of 2017, and in December we finally got a witness. And it was the following spring, in the Goodlatte Gowdy probe, after a lot of pushing and pulling and a lot of tug of war, we reached a deal with DOJ where we went down to DOJ, and they gave us access to documents, and they gave us access to, I think, north of 800,000 pages. But they made us come down there. They made us go into a skiff, and these documents weren't classified. And it wasn't until May and June of that year that we started this process when the investigation had been ongoing. And that is disappointing. Obviously, we all wish there was an easy button. But congressional investigations of consequence take time.
right. And it took, I think, 6 months before the first document was even produced. And like you said, you had to go down there and review it in camera. And then going back even further to Fast and Furious, the investigation of the death of a Border Patrol agent.
Yeah. Fast and Furious, we issued subpoenas. Mr. Issa sent some subpoenas, I think, in February of 2011. And we had a hearing in June with experts about proceeding to contempt. What does it take to go to contempt? And that was the first time in June when we got any production. And the production was largely publicly available information. And we spent most of the year trying to get information out of the Justice Department. At the time, we were also working with whistleblowers who were providing us documents. And Chairman Issa at the time, then in October, issued another subpoena that was to the Justice Department. And so the investigation had been ongoing most of the year. We were talking to whistleblowers, we're doing interviews, and we're doing our best to get documents out of the Justice Department through that channel. But these things take time.
Right.
Certainly not 76 days.
Yes. And if you truly want to uncover every fact, as you should in an impeachment, do you agree? You have to go to court sometimes and enforce your subpoenas. And here, my understanding is we have a lot of requests for information, voluntary information. Will you please provide us with documents on XYZ? And I think that's great. But you have to back it up with something. Isn't that correct?
There's a number of ways to enforce your requests. The fundamental rule of any congressional investigation is you rarely get what you're asking for unless and until the alternative is less palatable for the respondent. So, you issue a subpoena and you're trying to get documents. One technique you can use is try to talk to a document custodian or somebody in the Leg Affairs function about what documents exist. Chairman Chaffetz, during his era, he used to have these document production status hearings where you'd bring in Leg Affairs officials and try to get the lay of the land. Because, Leg Affairs officials, at least nominally, are supposed to be directly responsible, serving the interests. You can saber rattle. It's legal to saber rattle about holding somebody in contempt. Oftentimes, witnesses who are reluctant to cooperate and come forward, when you attach a contempt proceeding or a prospective contempt proceeding to their name, a lot of times that changes the outcome. And with a contempt proceeding, you've got a couple different steps along the way. You could raise the prospect of a contempt proceeding. You could schedule a contempt proceeding. After you schedule a contempt proceeding, you could hold the door open for documents or interviews, and then you could push it off. You could go through at the committee level. And these are all sort of milestone events which historically are unpalatable or less palatable for the administration that sometimes starts to move the needle. And with these types of disputes, once you get the ball rolling, with the Goodlatte Gowdy probe, we didn't get a witness, and it was Deputy Director Andrew McCabe in for, it was a couple months. But once we got Deputy Director McCabe in, a couple weeks later, we got Director Comey's chief of staff. A couple weeks later, the witnesses start. Once you get the ball rolling, again, you don't always like 100% of the terms. Sometimes you got to deal with agency counsel. Sometimes you got to go look in camera. But once you get the ball rolling, usually it leads to positive results and historically has allowed the Congress to do its work.
And were any of those things done here?
No.
In fact, they decided we're not going to subpoena certain people that are important. Is that fair to say? And we're not going to go to court and enforce them. So these people have, these folks that are caught in an interbranch struggle. And that's an unfortunate position for any employee of the
Well, one of the concerning things is Dr. Kupperman, who has been described by Dr. Fiona Hill and a number of witnesses as a solid citizen, a good witness. He filed a lawsuit in the face of a subpoena, and a judge was assigned to a Judge Leon. And the issues the Kupperman raised were slightly different than the Don McGahn issues, because Don McGahn is the the White House counsel. Kupperman, of course, is a national security official. Kupperman, filed the lawsuit seeking guidance. Kupperman wasn't asking the court to tell him not to come testify. To the contrary, Kupperman was seeking the court's guidance to facilitate his cooperation. And ultimately, the committee withdrew the subpoena, which raises questions about whether the committee is really interested in getting to the bottom of some of these issues.
Right. Instead, the committee's chosen, the Intelligence Committee has chosen to rely on Ambassador Sondland and his testimony. I think they rely 600 times in their report.
I'll tell you what I did. I on this point, yesterday, I opened the Democrat report and I did a Control F,
Yes.
Control F.
Yes.
And Sondland's name shows up, I think, 611 times. And in fairness, it's going to be double counted because, if it's in a sentence and then it's in a footnote, that's two. But in relative comparison to the other witnesses, Sondland's relied on big time.
Yes. And I think Dr. Hill testified that she, at some point, confronted him about his actions. And
The record is mixed on this front. Dr. Hill talks about raising concerns with Sondland, and Sondland in his deposition at least doesn't, he didn't share the same view.
And there's a lot of instances of that, where Ambassador Sondland recalls one thing and other witnesses recall another. Is that correct?
Sondland as a witness and he's a bit of an enigma. Let's just say it that way. He was he was pretty certain in his deposition that the security assistance wasn't linked to anything. And then he submitted an addendum.
Yes, I call that the pretzel sentence.
And even in that addendum or supplement or whatever it's called, it's talked to him and her, and anyway, Sondland ends with, I presumed.
Right.
So it wasn't really any firsthand information.
Right. We don't have a lot of firsthand information here, is that correct?
On certain facts, we don't. I mean, we have firsthand information on the May 23rd meeting in the Oval Office. We've got a lot of firsthand information, although all conflicting, on the July 10th meeting. There are, episodes, I think, during the course of this investigation that we have been able to at least get everyone's account. But the investigation hasn't been able to reveal, firsthand evidence relating to the president, other than the call transcript.
And I think we've already talked about this, that Ambassador Sondland would presume things, assume things, and form opinions based on what other people told him, and then he would use those as firsthand. Is that correct?
It started with his role with the Ukraine portfolio. A lot of people at the State Department were wondering why the ambassador to the EU was so engaged in issues relating to the Ukraine. And there are answers for that. Ukraine is an aspirant to join the EU. And there's a lot of other reasons, and Mr. Turner, I think, explored this really well at the open hearing. But we asked Ambassador Sondland, and he said that he did a TV interview in Kyiv on the 26th of July, where he said the president's given me, a lot of assignments, and the president's assigned me Ukraine and so forth. But then when we asked him in his deposition, he conceded that he was in fact spinning, that the president never assigned him to Ukraine, that he was just, he was exaggerating.
And I think at the public hearings, you pointed out that in contrast to other witnesses, Ambassador Sondland isn't a note taker. In fact, he said, I do not recall dozens of times in his deposition.
Let's say it this way. Ambassador Taylor walked us through his standard operating procedure for taking notes. He told us about having a notebook on his desk and a notebook in his coat pocket of his suit, and he brought it with us and he showed us. So consequently, when Ambassador Taylor recounts to us, what happened, it's backed up by these contemporaneous notes. Ambassador Sondland, on the other hand, was very clear that, on first hand, he said that he did not have access to his State Department records. While he said that at the public hearing, simultaneously, the State Department issued a tweet, I think, or a statement at least, saying that wasn't true, that nobody is keeping Ambassador Sondland from his emails. He's still a State Department employee. He can go, he does have access to his records, but he stated he didn't. And he stated that he doesn't have any notes because he doesn't take notes. And he conceded that he doesn't have recollections on a lot of these issues. And, we sort of made a list of them. And I think at the hearing, I called it the trifecta of unreliability.
Yes. And you're not the only person that has concerns about Ambassador Sondland's testimony, conduct. I think other witnesses took issue with his conduct. Is that correct?
Yeah, Tim Morrison talked about instances where an Ambassador Sondland was sort of showing up uninvited. Morrison didn't understand why Sondland was trying to get into the Warsaw meeting September 1st. And Dr. Hill, Fiona Hill, told us about issues of that sort. And a number of witnesses, you're correct.
And Ambassador Rieker and Ambassador Sondland too, correct?
Yeah, I believe Ambassador Rieker
Said he was a problem.
said he was a problem, yeah.
Yeah. And Dr. Hill raised concerns about his behavior and said that he might be an intelligence risk. Is that correct?
She did. She had issues with his tendency to pull out his mobile device and make telephone calls,
Right. And
which obviously can be monitored
yes.
by the bad guys.
And we talked about how he was spinning that, certain things, and he admitted that, how he was spinning.
He admitted he exaggerated.
Yes. And
He also, when it comes to his communications with the president, we tried to get him to list all the communications with the president. I think he gave us 6. And then when he was back at it, he walked us through each communication with the president. And by the way, it was about a Christmas party. It was about when the president of Finland was here. And then Congresswoman Spear asked him the same question in the open hearing, and he said that he had talked to the president like 20 times. So the record is mixed.
I think my time's up. Thank you both. Yield back.
The gentleman you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Under the 5-minute rule.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I move to recess for 30 minutes pursuant to Clause 1A of Rule 11.
He's not. Okay. Say no. The gentleman has moved I'm sorry. The gentleman has moved to recess for how long?
For 30 minutes, sir.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. No, no.
No.
The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Ask for a roll call vote, please.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries? No. Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline? No. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Steen?
No.
Ms. Steen votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
No.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
Chairman,
The,
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Cohen, you are not recorded.
I'd like to be recorded as no.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
are there any other members who wish to vote who have not voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 15 ayes and 24 noes.
The motion is not agreed to.